Hello and welcome to my first ever YouTube video. I am so excited to be starting BookTube. You might know me from Books with LK on TikTok, and if you're from there, hello, I am so happy to have you. Today we are doing my top 10 favorite books of all time. This is my ride or die list, the books that I could read over and over again and never get bored of. They're mostly fantasy, but I have a few other books from genres that I love. I read a range of everything from thrillers, dystopians, to contemporary novels, to literary fiction, just because I feel like I get stuck in fantasy, and reading too many in a row, especially high fantasy or epic fantasy, can put me in a slump. So I'm super excited to just get into this list. Obviously this is subject to change because my taste will change over time and maybe I can redo this list every year, but at the moment these are my top 10. And these are also not in order. I was going to do a top 5 books, but then I realized that I could not narrow it down for the life of me, so you're getting 10. I'm also just going to count series as one book on the list because it's easier that way. First up on this list is not a surprise at all if you know me from TikTok, and that is The Six of Crows duology. I had to put both of these books because I love Crooked Kingdom a little bit more than Six of Crows, but if I was picking an all-time favorite, this would probably be it. Like, checks out. My boyfriend got me these earrings for my birthday and I love them. I'm gonna wear them in literally every single YouTube video. So if you don't know what Six Crows is, it is a high standard story by Leigh Bardugo set in her Grishaverse, but it is a standalone duology, so you don't have to read the Shadow and Bone or King of Scars to understand what's going on in this, because the characters are an entirely different set from those in Shadow and Bone. A few of them show up, but it's not really that big of a deal if you don't know them. And it's essentially about this group of teenagers who come together in this criminal gang and want to make a bit of money. This lives up to the hype in every single way possible. In my mind, it's the perfect balance between character and plot driven. Somehow you get each of... Oh my god. Have I been burning my hair? I can smell it. Okay, so no candles. This is a process. It's a learning process, guys. Somehow you become obsessed with every single one of these 6 characters. You get inside all of their heads and you just get so invested in their development throughout the story. I think it's a brilliant example of showing such character depth with so many different perspectives, because that is so hard to do in multi-POV fantasy. If you were wondering, my favorite characters are Jesper and Inej. I love them so much. The second book on my list is Boy Swallow's Universe. This is a coming-of-age novel that tackles huge themes like poverty, violence, crime, and love. It's by an Australian author and journalist named Trent Dowden, and it's set in Brisbane in Queensland in the 1980s to 90s. We follow Eli, who starts off as a 12-year-old, and he has drug dealer parents. He lives in this neighborhood filled with crime gangs, and he has an older brother who does not speak. On top of that, they have this babysitter who's Eli's mentor, and he has come out of prison recently because he was sentenced to life for murder. And in all of that, Eli has these dreams to become a journalist, and he is a soppy romantic. I think it's so brilliantly written from a child's perspective because Dalton took inspiration from his own life and growing up in Australia, and it is very, very Australian, so I think that's one of the reasons that I connected to it so much. But it's also really nice to read about the love and the joy and the happiness within all these dark times, because he's a kid and you really see that push through in the pages. Also, the way Trent Dalton weaves his words is just brilliant, and you never really know where this book is going. The ending was just no words, but it is wild. That's all I'll say. Continuing with incredible Australian authors, we have The Book Thief. This has over 2 million ratings on Goodreads, and it has an incredible average rating, so I feel like it's pretty typical to find this on favorite books list, but I can't skip it. I read this and I studied it when I was in year 8, and it changed my life. I'd never read a book that was told from the perspective of a higher being, in this case death, and it was monumental for the way that I wrote my own stories and considered them from different perspectives, and it just opened my mind. I can't explain it any better than that. We follow a young girl named Liesel who lives with her foster parents during World War II in Nazi Germany, and they hide a Jewish man inside their house. This is similar to Boy Swallow's Universe in that the story follows an innocent child in the midst of a really heavy themes like war and politics for this. In the midst of the terrible things going on in this book, there are some real genuine characters, and it's so interesting reading about the relationships that they form, whether it's friendship or family or romance. We get to explore the power of books, of words, of language, of reading, and that's mostly explored through the living characters who have to overcome things like guilt and grief. It is heartbreaking and so sad, and in my opinion, they're the best kind of books. Next up is the Puppy War trilogy. This was my first venture into adult fantasy, and I have never read a better debut. I would encourage anyone who is considering, well, you probably should get into the habit of checking trigger warnings before you read anything, but especially this book. The Puppy War is inspired by a lot of brutal events and conflicts in East Asia. The story takes a lot of inspiration from real life figures and real historical events, so it also uses those to create the magic system, the politics, the military strategy behind it. So this is a fantasy book, but I think it's important to keep in mind that it is real life history, and a lot of it is taken straight from the history books. We follow Rin in the Puppy War trilogy, and she is one of the most interesting and complex characters I have ever read about. The first book centers around her journey at an elite military academy and her developing powers, or her magic as a shaman. And then about 3/4 of the way through this book, it takes a dramatic turn, and the rest of the trilogy pretty much follows the war and Rin's journey as this magical weapon. Rin's journey is a very unique one. She is not your average hero. She's not a stereotypical anti-hero. I think it's very, very complex. She has lots of layers, but I loved Rin's perspective because I think the onus is on the reader to realize, hey, is this really what's going on here? Do we have an unreliable narrator? And kind of have our own interpretation of the reason why Rin does the things that she does. Because while I love a good revenge arc, there is so much more going on below the surface here, and it tackles some huge personal themes and the way that war impacts the individual. The side characters are also really complex themselves and super engaging, and even if you love or hate them, it's hard not to acknowledge that they are written extremely well. Next up, we have Vicious. This is the only fantasy book I have read in a single day. This is about two arch enemies, Victor and Eli, who are on different sides of the moral problem of whether superheroes should be allowed to exist in society. In this book, they're called extraordinary individuals, or EOs, and the way that their powers manifest is so cool. I won't spoil anything, but it's so unique. I love the way Schwab writes magic. It's written in this fast-paced style of time jumps and constant pov switches and really short chapters, and it's kind of jumps between their college days when they were friends and the present day when they are not friends. It's all so morally grey. The characters are so effed up, but they're so hard not to love. And I also take huge inspiration from Schwab's writing. I think it's so direct and to the point, but it has so much weight behind it. And her ability to make these short sentences so powerful is really inspiring to me, so I look up to this book a lot. This has a sequel called Vengeful. It's a lot longer than Vicious is, and it took me a lot longer to read. It's not as good, but it's still a masterpiece. Now I've allowed myself one nostalgic pick on this list, and I have decided to select Deltora Quest. This is by another Australian author called Emily Rodder. This series is, I think, 8 books, but this has kind of shoved them all together. You could literally read this entire series, I think, in a day. This is a kid's book. It's by no means the best fantasy book that's out there, but as a child, I was obsessed with this story. It follows 3 companions, Leaf, Bard, and Jasmine, on their magical quest around the land of Deltora to collect the stolen gems and return them to the Belt of Deltora to stop the evil Shadow Lord. It's all the quest fantasy and collecting items fantasy that I loved so much as a kid. I think there's 3 kind of series. There's the belt, and then there's this recorder. They have to collect these pieces of this recorder, and then there's one where they collect these dragon gems. This was even an anime show that I loved as a kid. It's probably terrible now that I think back on it, but I just love it. And it kind of feels like each book in this series, they're in a different world, because Deltora is so vast and massive, and the land is so vivid and unique. Like, there's all these amazing mythological animals, and it's just so cool. I love it. Next up, we have The Jasmine Throne. This is the blueprint for how to write an amazing fantasy world and magic system. I have never flown through a book so fast that is so focused on its world building. This is told from a huge range of perspectives, and I love that because it gives us these human voices to the different city-states of the Empire. Our sapphic main characters are Priya, a maidservant with a little hidden magical past, and Malini, who is an imprisoned princess. She's being held captive by her horrible brother, who is also the Emperor. I would compare this to Game of Thrones, but way more women and Indian inspired, because there is such a vast amount of characters and people and religion and these magic systems, and there's all these different factors that wove in together to create this story that is so vast, but it's so unique at the same time. The romance is also an added bonus. It was very sweet and perfectly paced for me. This trilogy is unfinished. I had a few problems with the second book just because I felt like the pace slowed down a little bit too much for me and the characters weren't developed enough, but I have really high hopes for the final book in the trilogy. This series, I feel like, does not need explaining. The Hunger Games is timeless for me. I read it as a child. I loved it to death. I was so obsessed. I wrote my own 4th Hunger Games book, and now as an adult I can read it again and see, oh my gosh, this is a commentary. This is a real dystopian book that has such interesting and clever messages woven throughout it. Dystopian fiction is something I will always come back to, and The Hunger Games holds such a special place in my heart. Part of why I love it so much is because it has that stark gender role switch where you have Katniss, who exhibits the more masculine traits, and then you have Peter, who is this baker, and he's soft and kind and sweet. And I just think that that was so important to read. When I was little, I had Katniss, and she was like just angry all the time, and I'd never seen a woman in a book so angry like that. Obviously now that is not the case. There are so many angry women in fiction, and I have so many books to choose from, but this will always be my favorite. And Joanna Mason will forever be one of my favorite characters to ever exist. Ooh! A Day of Fallen Night. This is the prequel standalone to A Prior of the Orange Tree. This is the ARC copy I was lucky enough to get sent by Bloomsbury. Just a moment, because It is gorgeous. This is set a few hundred years before Prairie, I believe. Don't quote me on that, but it's a tale of all of these different characters, and it weaves this story of coming of age, love, betrayal, dragons, war, politics. It just has everything. This is the kind of book you would read only when you're in that high fantasy mood, because it is dense, but oh my god, the world building is beautiful. I loved every point of view, which is something that happens very, very rarely for me. I tend to shy away from some just because they're boring, or I don't like the characters as much as I like the others, but every single one was brilliant in this. There's also some really interesting discussions that this book sparks about women in power in fantasy books and their agency and the pressures that are put on them to do with making an heir and making allies, and the sacrifices that they have to make despite being in positions of power. I love reading about women in epic fantasy, and this has just such a diverse cast of people and relationships and family dynamics. These kinds of books are just so important for me in my own reading and for fantasy literature in general. And last but certainly not least is one of my favorite books and romances of all time, Heartstopper. I don't think I've ever smiled while reading a book this much. It's a graphic novel, and I flew through all 4 of the books in this series in a few hours. We follow Charlie and his relationship with a boy named Nick, and this story is important to me and so many other people because of its representation of queerness and mental health and trauma, but it's also one of the happiest stories, and just I love it. I'd never read a book where queerness was so celebrated and was so normal, so reading this was such a game changer, and even watching the show when it came out made me cry, and I didn't know why. And I think it's just because it has representation that is so specific and so helpful for young people who are struggling with their identity. It validates that, and it's just beautiful. It's just happiness and rainbows. I love it. So thank you guys so much for watching. If you'd like to check out my TikTok where I post more regularly, that will be linked in the description. I'm going to try and post weekly or twice weekly on this channel. It depends how much time I have, because obviously work and uni gets in the way, but I'm so excited to be starting on BookTube. Let me know what your favorite books are in the comments. I would love to know your top 10s, because I think it's so hard to narrow it down. I struggled for a few hours coming up with this list, so let me know.